China's killing our canola. $45 billion gone. Western farmers bleed. Mark Carney, silent. Made millions off Beijing's dime. He won't fight. He's Beijing's banker, not our prime minister.
Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. Today is Thursday, April the 24th. With me tonight is Dr. Jack Mintz, one of Canada's foremost economists and original thinkers. Good evening, Jack.
Good evening, Nigel. Great to see you.
Great to have you back on the show. Jack, with the general election now upon us, both the Liberals and the Conservatives have laid out their financial plans. And in many ways, they look a lot like each other. Both call for borrowing, although in the Liberal case, to massive borrowing. Both call for personal income tax cuts. The Conservatives slightly more ambitious than the Liberal. Both have sworn off the consumer carbon tax. Both have cancelled proposed increases to the capital gains tax and to eliminate GST on the purchase of new homes up to $1 million or $1.3 million. So two questions to start. First, a lot of those things started with Poilievre. Have the Liberals simply cut and pasted the Conservative platform? And second, I am astonished that Mr. Carney is going to the voters with a plan to borrow $225 billion over 4 years. The federal debt is already $1.2 trillion, and that's caused huge inflation. $10 a dozen eggs, $7 butter. Don't know what it's like back there east where you are, but that's how it is out west. Now Mr. Carney has run two central banks, and by his own admission, he knows how things work, so he must know all this. Can you theorize, Jack, why he would plan a 20% increase in the federal debt with all that means for ordinary people at the gas pump and the grocery checkout?
Well, first of all, just in response to your questions, with regard to the plans that are being proposed by both the Conservatives and the Liberals, I think it's the numbers are less important than the philosophy underlying them. In the case of the Liberals, it's sort of something that Mr. Carney has said himself, that the way to grow the economy is by the government. And in fact, he's ready to set up a whole bunch of funds that will work with the private sector to catalyze, as he keeps using that word, to catalyze private investment. In other words, the government picking the winners from the losers and subsidizing in private investment through various grants, tax credits, whatever. That would be kind of looking like a Brookfield type fund that would be working with partners to, make investments in infrastructure and other things. That, of course, is one philosophy that basically says that the only way to get things going is that the government has to throw money at it. The other philosophy is to say that the government should get out of the way from the private sector, deregulate, cut taxes, significant tax reform, other types of policies that will spur private investment, because right now it's an obstacle to investment. And that's really what the Conservative plan is about. So those are two very, very different philosophies. And I think it's reflective in both the policy platforms of the two candidate parties. With regard to the debt issue, for sure, it is a serious issue. And in fact, I don't take the numbers underlying these two platforms very seriously, because they very much, I think, underestimate the impact of a potential recession that we're going to see next year, potentially even the year after, but even just a 1-year recession, but with particularly slow growth, all due to the disruption that is now happening at the international level, particularly with respect to tariff policy that the Trump administration has been pushing. And even last night, Trump, who I think somehow, I guess he wishes Carney wins because he keeps interfering at the right time, saying, I want that auto industry all in the United States, and I don't want any more cars produced in Canada. So, given that 90% of our exports and autos is to United States, and in fact, 82% of the automobiles that are produced in Canada are exported to the United States. That would, of course, have huge ramifications for the Canadian economy. All this suggests is that the numbers that are being used in these plans, in my view, should have been redone with a much more prudent assumption about how much growth we're going to get. The plans are actually based on average, about close to a 4% average growth rate, nominal growth rate in GDP over the 4-year period, and I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, the IMF has already marked down Canadian growth by 0.6% this year and 0.4% next year, with the based on the Trump tariffs, and the plans were really using numbers that were based at the end of the fall of 2024, which I think were reasonably done at that point, but needed to be revised downward. But I would have taken a very risk management type point of view and say, what happens if this is what happens in terms of the economy, where let's say we virtually have no real growth this coming year, and then and the year after a much lower growth rate than what's being assumed, and then ask the question, how much debt can we really afford having before it starts becoming sky high and pushes up prices, as you've mentioned, and potentially leads to problems in the difficulty of selling our debt to international lenders who might start looking at Canada as too risky, especially given our terrible growth rate that we've had over the past decade.
Well, Jack, I mean, we're sort of getting close to the, I won't call it science fiction, but the speculation about just how bad things can get. Now, you'll be well aware that there's an office within the Privy Council office, and for readers and listeners who maybe don't have the intimate knowledge that you have of government, there is the Prime Minister's office, and then there's the mirror image, the Privy Council office, which supplies a lot of the information and the facts that the PMO can choose to accept or ignore. But within the Privy Council office, very high-level civil service, there is a little department whose job it is to look ahead and make informed speculations. And this little office has come out with a report. I think it actually came out in January, but it just hit the headlines now, saying that by 2040, Canada is going to be, if present trends continue, well, a third world country. We've already got the colored money, Jack. So what do we make of a report like that when you see the kind of assumptions that are underlying the policies and the platforms of the two major parties? I mean, everybody thinks the Liberals are going to win. That's what the polls say. Well, if they win, then all the policies that you've just talked about and the assumptions that you've talked about, how the government is your friend and is going to fix everything, are going to come about. And then is this actually going to take us down this destructive path that the PCO has imagined?
Well, it's so first of all, I actually do know about that small operation in the Privy Council. It's been there actually for quite a while, and I used to know the person that actually started a number of years ago. And they do work on kind of like long-term trends, and of course, I think that's a useful exercise to go through. How credible that forecast is going to be is a different story, but certainly there has been a lot of work done showing that Canada is going to be having the lowest growth rate of all the OECD countries. We have now our GDP per capita has now fallen to close to the OECD average now. We don't even shine anymore. And in fact, if you do have really low growth in Canada compared to everybody else, we are going to get down to the lower parts. We may not be a third world country, but we might start looking more like a middle income country if we keep on the path that we're moving on. And I think this is an issue that I have been terribly concerned about. In fact, last Friday I wrote about Ontario, which is the slowest growth province in Canada over the past 2 decades. and is now starting to look like the sick man of North America, just like Turkey or the Ottoman Empire looked like the sick man of Europe back in the 19th century. And in fact, when you look at per capita incomes in Ontario now, it's very little different than the poorest states in the United States, like Alabama and South Carolina, and a little bit more than Mississippi. So it is very concerning about the direction that we're going, especially a province like Ontario, which is 40% of Canada's GDP, that it's doing so poorly. And I think we need our politicians to wake up and consider that really what we need to look for the future is really a big bang in terms of policies. And when I read the two platforms, both liberal and the conservative platforms, there's a lot of ideas there. In fact, some of them I do like, and especially the ones with deregulation and particularly. But I would say they're kind of what a lot of them are marginal reforms, because there's so many different things that are being proposed. The liberal platform has like 130 different measures, and they're all little bits spent here and there, splayed around the country. It's not going to do much to Canadian economic growth. And of course, if the Liberal Party is going to be operating on the basis of we're going to grow things by picking the winners that are going to be responsible for Canadian growth. We know that Canadian governments are very poor at picking winners from losers, but we also know that losers are pretty good at picking governments, particularly when they're looking for subsidies. So I think this is, not the right approach. In fact, I'm much more attuned to what the Conservatives are proposing, which is very similar to what we did in the 1980s, when we had to get out of the lethargy of a high debt country with very low growth, high inflation. Back in 1984, when the Mulroney government came in, it privatized, it deregulated, it introduced tax reform, but also, most important, they developed the free trade agreement with the United States. I know it was a different era, but the main point is that this was the kind of approach that we need now in our public policy. Bold ideas that are going to get the economy moving, and particularly relying on the resilience of the private sector, which I think is very strong in Canada, to achieve the kind of goals that we want to see in terms of better prosperity in this country.
Does it concern you that even the Conservatives, who I think you tend to favor in this in this discussion, even the Conservatives are talking about running a deficit for the period of the next 4 years? $35 billion, I think it was the number.
No, well, actually, yeah, the total deficit's add up to 100 billion as opposed to 225 billion.
Okay.
However, the baseline deficit, in other words, if you take what the parties assume would be the deficit before making any policy or taking any policy actions, is 140 billion. So actually, the Conservatives actually reduced deficits relative to the baseline by about 38 billion. Not huge, but certainly in the right direction. The Liberals, on the other hand, as you mentioned, are going up to 225 billion, which is almost an additional 85 billion to the deficits that were already expected, according to the baseline calculations. So you clearly two different directions. One where there's going to be bigger deficits and higher debt, and the other one where there's going to be at least some constraint on deficits and bringing down some of the debt potential by undertaking those constraints. So one might say, well, the Conservatives should have gone harder in terms of reducing deficits and spending. And certainly I think that's a criticism that can be made, which goes back to my point that if we're going to really get Canada out of its lethargy and reverse what has been a bad decade of poor economic growth, in fact, virtually no economic growth on a per person level, then we need policies that are going to really shock the economy forward. We're not as bad as Argentina, but as we've seen, Argentina has taken on huge changes in public policy, and they're starting to right, which has been a very bad situation there. We're not like Argentina, but I don't want us to become Argentina either in 100 years.
Now, the conservatives have been criticized in that they make these promises to bring down the deficit, but the means by which they mean to do it are either through programs that don't yet exist or through strategies. I mean, it was talked about getting rid of consultants, and that's not a bad thing to do because civil servants should be able to shouldn't be constantly trying to offload responsibility to consultants. But I mean, does it all add up to enough to do the job? Are their plans reasonable?
Well, I think some of the things they did is quite reasonable. They've been criticized for booking revenue numbers for deregulation. So, for example, getting rid of the cap on oil and gas emissions. They had a revenue number associated with that. Also, some of the other policies like the Impact Assessment Act, which has been discouraging not only pipelines but even mining and some other resource investments as well. And so they booked numbers associated with that. That's called dynamic scoring. It's used by the Congressional Budget Office in the United States. There's always been a criticism that if you just book, what you think is the static cost of making a change. So in the case of a regulation, you assume there is no additional revenue. It's a mistake. And so what I know the conservatives did is that they actually based it on studies, a number of them parliamentary budget office studies that were well done and fairly conservatively done, that showed the impact of, let's say, getting rid of the oil and gas emissions cap, the impact on GDP. And then once you know the impact on GDP, given that federal revenues are about 14% of GDP, then you can estimate, how much additional revenue will come because of the growth that comes from deregulation. I think that's a very good policy or a very good methodology, because it starts putting some emphasis on things like deregulation that can help grow the economy. Also, tax cuts. If we don't take into account that tax cuts can actually spur growth in the economy, then you tend to exaggerate the cost of the tax cut because you're not taking into account some of the pickup in revenue that you get from having more growth. And so that's another reason why dynamic scoring has been used in the United States. And I think it's something that we should be doing in Canada as well.
Well, now you've made I think everybody would probably be everybody who watches this program anyways, probably nodding in violent agreement with you about the quality of these policies. But here's the thing. One of the crown jewels of the conservative platform is the so-called resource corridor within which development can be expedited. But in 4 years, let's say they win the election and they've got 4 years to do the work, and let's say they are able to put that resource corridor in place and do all the other good things you just talked about, can those things do what they are promising to do in the 4-year term that they would have?
Oh, I think you're right. There are going to be some things that are going to take longer to really see the fruits of. But again, it depends on how quickly you can do some of these corridors. Corridors are used, particularly in Australia, at great benefit to the country. It's also used in a number of other countries, and it's a matter of you may not do it right across the whole country. That's going to take a very long time. But there may be areas that you could do it. For example, a corridor that goes from, let's say, Alberta to British Columbia, that you can put in pipelines, electric transmission lines, etc. And would the benefits appear in the very first 4 years? Maybe not. Maybe some benefits will be realized, because if you can get it done get the corridor established within a couple of years, then by the end of the 4 years, you might get some positive results. But certainly, I think the movement towards that is, I think, very important. And I notice even, the Liberal plan has corridors as well. And so this is one thing I'm actually glad to see, that both major parties are talking about this approach to getting resource development through. The concern I have with respect to the Liberal plan is that I think they're more focused on electricity. And it's not clear that they're interested in oil and gas, when LNG itself, we exported LNG to China, Japan, and other countries in Europe, uh, it may increase our own emissions, but from a worldwide perspective, it would reduce emissions if it's a matter of replacing coal, which is currently used in a number of the countries. So, um, we have to remember, greenhouse gas emissions, the impact of temperature, it's a worldwide impact, not any one specific country, but the total amount across all countries. So we really have to look at how you reduce worldwide emissions, not just, even if one action by a country increases its own emissions, if it reduces worldwide emissions, that's a good thing. So I think, the corridor concept, I think, would be very valuable to have, but we'll have to see, of course, how far it goes down the road, given that Canada is already has a reputation internationally as being very slow in permitting, very slow in contract formation. A number of studies have shown how poorly we do. In fact, we're closer to the bottom of the OECD countries when it comes to the cost of doing business in this country. And so, again, that's an area that's going to need significant change that will be pushed, I think, by any government that's going to come into power, especially given the Liberals have also expressed interest in corridors and improving regulation. Whether they have the solutions or not is another story.
Jack, we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you one thing that the Liberals are very proud of, and that is their plans to build prefabricated housing in great quantity to take care of what everybody acknowledges is a serious housing crisis, one that has been generated by excessive immigration, perhaps. And nevertheless, the people are here, they don't have a place to live. And they're talking about prefabricated housing. Now, that along with alternative energy is something that Brookfield has great experience with. And of course, Mr. Carney would be familiar with that. So I can imagine where these ideas are coming from. But, I grew up in Great Britain right after the war, and we had prefabricated houses everywhere. And there was a reason for that. The housing stock had been bombed out and people had to live somewhere. So they threw together what they could. But nobody ever said, my goal is to live in a prefab. There are still some out there. They were well built. Most of them are gone, but there are still some out there. But typically, there are social problems that come with living in that kind of inexpensive, relatively publicly funded, publicly operated housing. Do you have any more faith in that plan than I do?
Well, it's not entirely clear that's the best approach. In fact, I don't mind if people have a demand for it and they would like to have it built. In fact, right now, I did some reading on it. Actually, ATCO in Alberta is actually one of the biggest builders of prefabricated housing. And of course, the issue is that it requires land. And I think that's going to be the biggest problem, is the fact that it's still land-intensive housing. We could put Saudi huts on land. In fact, if anyone wants to know what a Saudi hut is, you just go to Calgary Heritage Park. It's what the Westerners originally lived in. These
Yes.
grass hills, which were very cheap to make, and they had a lot of land, of course, to live around it. But the prefabricated homes will still require land, and it's not entirely clear that this is going to be necessarily the only or best option. In big urban centers, of course, condos tend to be a lot less land intensive. The problem with condos, of course, is that for families that want to have a backyard and et cetera, you need to have land. So I'm not convinced that fabricated housing is going to be the solution. In fact, we shouldn't try to push in any one direction. I think we need to have housing built for the different demands that are out there. And so I like policies which both the Conservatives and Liberals have, like reducing development charges, cutting taxes, GST, for example, on housing. And there's some negatives associated with that, but I think that should be done. I think the provinces should get out of their land transfer taxes. In Ontario and in Toronto, they're double the Ontario rate, because the Toronto has the land transfer tax as well. It's a huge tax on mobility, but it adds to the purchase cost of housing.
Mhm.
to a very large extent. So there's a whole bunch of policies that I think we can do to lower the cost of housing without telling people, well, you have to buy a prefab as opposed to something else. And this goes back to, I think, do you have policies that tell people what to do, or just get governments out of the way? And that's why I prefer kind of those policies that are going to get the government out of the way.
Amen to that. Jack, thank you for this. My wife and I are going to be out in the country this weekend with our little handbook of edible plants, just in case the Privy Council officers got it right. Would you care to risk your reputation on a guess on what's going to happen on Monday? Go on, I dare you.
Or maybe Tuesday, I think, is the election.
The 28th. Yes.
Or the 28th. Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot. I've already voted. So anyway, yes. Am I going to predict? Yes. I think the Liberals will win, but whether they get a majority is another story. It's we'll have to see.
Well, Jack, all the polls agree with you. And some of us are ready to, as I say, take to the hills. This has been great. Thank you very much, Jack. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.